The material universe is a crucible of agonizing volume. To breathe the air of a nameless tomb world is to inhale the ash of dead aeons mixed with the sharp tang of superheated ozone. Warfare in this blasted epoch is a deafening sensory nightmare. Concussive shockwaves from mass-reactive bolter fire shatter the air, compressing the lungs and rupturing the eardrums of anyone standing too close. Through this storm of atrocity moves an inquisitor of the Holy Ordos, battered and bleeding out his final measure of devotion. Arterial blood sprays hot and wet across the obsidian dust, a brilliant, terrifying crimson against the dead grey of the ancient stone. The frantic, desperate heartbeat of a mortal servant hammers like a trapped animal against the cage of their ribs. Adrenaline and blind faith push the broken muscles past the point of agonizing failure. Every gasp for oxygen burns the throat with the ambient heat of discharging energy weapons. This is the ultimate tragedy of our mortal coil. Humanity is bound entirely by its fragile biology, a pathetic architecture of yielding flesh, brittle bone, and vulnerable nerve endings that can be extinguished by a single misstep. We are slaves to pain, beholden to fatigue, and destined to rot. We hurl this pathetic flesh against the supreme horror of the soulless machines, entities born of a blasphemous pact that traded mortal suffering for eternal stagnation. Their bodies are woven from necrodermis, a cold, adaptive living metal that defies the laws of nature, knitting together even as it is blown apart. They possess no blood to spill, no lungs to crush, and no soul to terrorize. We fight them with the desperate fury of the dying, while they endure with the cold patience of the grave. Towering above the ruined humans stands a Necron overlord. It is a monarch of silent slaughter, an entity constructed of ancient living metal that moves with a terrifying, unnatural fluidity that mocks the natural flow of life. Where the Inquisitor thrashes in the dust, consumed by the frantic heat of survival, the Xenos monarch is perfectly still. It is utterly indifferent to the pathetic fury unleashed upon it, remaining pristine and untouched amidst the deafening storm of explosive ordnance. The Overlord observes the screaming, bleeding human not as a rival warrior, but as a minor insect buzzing against the monolith of eternity. The deafening roar of the physical universe, the wet tearing of mortal flesh, and the concussive force of bolter rounds mean nothing to an intellect that has slept in the dark for 60 million years. Slowly, the mechanical tyrant decides that this noisy display of mortal defiance has become a bothersome nuisance. The undying archivist does not even bother to raise its crackling, empathic obliterator to deliver a merciful killing blow. Instead, the undying sovereign lowers its skeletal hand, reaching into a shimmering dimensional fold to draw forth a strange, pulsing artifact. The fury of the melee dies in an instant. The killing blow hangs suspended in the choked air. Time itself seems to thicken into a viscous crawl, trapping the Inquisitor in a state of horrifying paralysis. Against this frozen tableau of violence, the Necron Overlord remains utterly still. In its skeletal metallic grasp, a small geometric object awakens. This is not the sudden, crude detonation of human weaponry. It is the deliberate unfolding of impossible architecture. A sickly, blinding emerald radiance bleeds from the artifact. This light does not illuminate the grim battlefield. Instead, it devours the ambient dawn, swallowing every photon it touches. Shadows are violently warped, stretching toward the light source rather than away from it. The cacophony of war, the screams of the dying and the roar of bolter fire is abruptly erased. A suffocating vacuum of absolute silence rushes in to fill the void. Within the Overlord's hand, the hypercube begins to spin. It expands in agonizing slow motion. Its edges multiply and fold infinitely inward upon themselves, defying the very laws of spatial reality. To gaze upon this shifting geometry is to invite madness. This is a Tesseract Labyrinth. It is an artifact of ancient, malevolent design that dates back to the war in heaven. The device is not a mere physical cage forged of metal and force fields. It is a literal fracture in the fabric of the universe. The labyrinth is a pocket dimension, folded out of reality using principles of physics so Xenos that the learned magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus would decry them as profane tech heresy. It relies on dimensional architecture that demonstrates an unholy understanding of the cosmos, manipulating mass and volume as easily as a mortal might fold a sheet of parchment. To the tech priests of Mars, the very existence of such a relic is a profound affront to the Omnissiah. It represents a supreme heresy of science, an abyss of cold knowledge that threatens to unravel the sanity of anyone attempting to calculate its workings. The cube continues its impossible rotation, growing ever larger as the overlapping angles slice through the material plane. The terrible silence deepens. The sickly green aura intensifies into a predatory glare. The unnatural forces radiating from the hypercube lock the Inquisitor in place, denying any desperate attempt at salvation or evasion. Reality groans under the weight of the expanding artifact. Then, with a silent, blinding eruption of non-Euclidean angles, the emerald light surges forward. It violently envelops the paralyzed servant of the Emperor. The physical world dissolves as the crushing weight of the artificial dimension asserts its absolute dominion, severing the Inquisitor entirely from the blood-soaked soil of the material battlefield. To be unmade by the Xenos is a terror known to the countless billions serving the Golden Throne, but to be mathematically compressed by ancient Necron artifice is a violation of the very soul. The blinding emerald luminescence does not merely scorch the flesh or superheat the ceramite of his armor. It seizes the fragile mortal framework and forcefully drags three-dimensional biology across a punishing fourth-dimensional axis. There is no physical wound, no spilling of the sacred blood, yet the agony is absolute and unending. It is the sheer, incomprehensible torment of existential translation. The Inquisitor is stripped of all physical autonomy in a single heartbeat, caught in a cataclysmic shift where the fundamental laws of material reality are violently suspended. Beneath the skin, the human form becomes a wretched canvas for impossible non-Euclidean nightmares. Organs fold inward upon themselves in grotesque, overlapping geometries, twisting through spaces that should not exist, yet miraculously they do not tear. The heart beats inside out, pumping dread into a void as the arteries loop into infinite paradoxical fractals. A sickening, silent chorus of internal pressure echoes through the nervous system as dense, calcified bones are mercilessly crushed. They do not shatter or splinter under the impossible invisible weight. Instead, the entire skeletal structure is violently collapsed down into singular mathematical points of absolute density. The fragile, aqueous fluid within the eyes seethes with unnatural energies, forcing the captive's vision into a blinding, agonizing kaleidoscope of Necron fractals and shifting glyphs without entirely destroying the organic tissues. The mortal mind simply cannot process this fundamental desecration of the God Emperor's design. Neurological pathways erupt in catastrophic, blinding misfires as the brain desperately attempts to reject the unnatural sensory input. Synapses scream and overload under the weight of an eternity compressed into a single agonizing microsecond. A crushing terminal vertigo seizes the fragmented consciousness. The Inquisitor experiences the terrifying, nauseating sensation of falling upward in every conceivable direction at once. Gravity is no longer a reliable physical force, but a localized sickness tearing mercilessly at the inner ear and the soul alike. The overpowering, bitter taste of metallic ozone floods the mouth, thick and suffocating like the atomic ash of a dead star. It is the foul flavor of reality itself breaking apart at the subatomic seams. Scream after silent scream is swallowed entirely by the howling, unfeeling void of the unfolding capture sequence. Flesh, bone, and spirit are stretched mercilessly across an endless precipice of sick green fire and impossible spatial inversion. The agony builds until the biological framework threatens to dissolve entirely into a stream of meaningless, glowing numbers. Then, without warning, the violent translation process abruptly halts. The horrific sensation of infinite multidimensional falling is brutally severed. reality shudders, violently reconstructs, and solidifies with a sickening, bone-rattling impact. The agonizing compression suddenly releases its suffocating grip, mercilessly dumping the battered, heaving form onto the cold, unforgiving surface of an impossibly Xenos environment. The agony of translation evaporates, leaving behind a profound and terrifying emptiness. The searing heat of the battlefield is gone. The choking dust and the metallic stench of spilled blood have been entirely erased from existence. In their place is a sensory void so absolute that it threatens to shatter the fragile human mind. There is no sound here. Yet this silence is not a mere absence of noise, but a living, oppressive force. It is a suffocating physical weight that presses inward from all sides, crushing the eardrums and drowning the frantic beating of a solitary human heart. The Inquisitor is entirely alone. Slowly, trembling eyelids part to behold the interior of the Xenos prison. The sight defies all rational comprehension. Before the servant of the Golden Throne lies a surreal, impossible expanse of cold, glowing green pathways. These jagged arteries of viridian light intersect at maddening angles, suspended eternally within an absolute starless void. There is no horizon, no sky, and no ground to anchor the mortal soul. It is an architecture of madness, drawn in hard, unyielding light. To understand the horror of this place, one must understand the minds of its architects. The soulless lords of the Necron dynasties do not view the warp and weft of reality with reverence. Where humanity sees the divine mystery of creation, the Necrons see only raw, mathematical material to be shaped and subjugated. To them, pocket dimensions are not miracles of cosmic scale. They are merely convenient dimensional vaults, effortlessly folded and manipulated by a science that eclipses human comprehension. Their mastery over the fabric of creation is absolute and godlike, allowing them to carve out isolated bubbles of non-reality just to house their curiosities and their enemies. They lock away living souls in geometric tombs with the same casual indifference a scribe might use to seal a parchment in a stasis vault. The Inquisitor breathes in an atmosphere that is perfectly sterile and chillingly stagnant. Survival in this initial moment offers no true comfort, only the dreadful clarity of absolute isolation. The body remains physically intact, yet the spirit is violently disoriented by the utter lack of natural landmarks. Reason attempts to reassert its dominion over the panic rising in the human mind. The mind demands movement, demanding that the body seek an exit or a tactical advantage in the endless dark. The Inquisitor commands their muscles to act, preparing to navigate this glowing, impossible maze. A foot is raised to test the emerald bridge that stretches into the infinite abyss. Yet even before the boot makes contact with the cold, luminous stone, a fundamental wrongness bleeds into the senses. The very air resists in ways that flesh was never meant to endure, as the dread revelation takes hold that the sacred laws of physics have been left far behind. To step beyond the threshold of the silent void is to surrender the very concept of sanity. The Inquisitor moves deeper into the belly of the labyrinth, but the simple act of placing one boot ahead of the other becomes an exercise in madness. Here, the architecture does not merely house the intruder, it actively despises the mortal mind. The corridors are forged from cold, dark metal of unknown provenance, absorbing the lumen glow like starved beasts. Between these oppressive iron veins stretch walls of solid, hard light, glowing with a sickly, bruised luminescence. Do not look away from them. The moment the human eye blinks or turns, the geometry silently shifts. Angles snap into impossible configurations, and intersecting planes gnash together in a mocking reassembly of space. The air grows impossibly tight, pressing against the Inquisitor's armor until breath itself feels like a luxury denied. Claustrophobia takes root in the marrow, squeezing the heart in a grip of iron. Yet paradoxically, this crushing confinement is paired with a staggering, nauseating vertigo. The path ahead offers a grand, spiraling staircase, ascending into the suffocating gloom. The Inquisitor climbs, muscles burning with the effort of ascending 100 rusted steps, and then 1,000. And yet, upon reaching the summit, they find themselves standing at the exact bottom of the very same stairwell. It is a hateful loop of unending elevation that goes nowhere, a physical manifestation of paradox designed to break the spirit. The fundamental law of direction is utterly murdered within these walls. To walk forward is to realize that the destination has slipped sideways, or perhaps into a dimension entirely unseen. Every step is a gamble against spatial reality. The Inquisition teaches its agents to trust their instincts, but here, human spatial awareness is a fatal flaw. The inner ear screams in perpetual agony. The Inquisitor dares to cast their gaze upward, seeking a ceiling, but there is no sky, and there is no zenith. Hanging mere inches above their head is another corridor, inverted and perfectly realized. Figures could walk upon that upper floor, bound by their own localized gravity, unaware of the wretch staring up at them. It is so close the Inquisitor could almost reach out and brush the rusted grating of that inverted pathway. Yet the sheer, terrifying wrongness of the dimension dictates that it is infinitely distant, separated by a gulf of mangled physics that no void ship could ever cross. To merely behold such architectural heresy is a profound ache upon the mortal soul. The mind fractures trying to process the proximity of the infinite. The stomach heaves as the eye tracks lines of perspective that converge, cross, and then bleed into extra-dimensional nothingness. It is a cage of pure, calculated irrationality. The cold metal seems to pulse with a predatory rhythm, waiting for the frail human intellect to snap under the weight of an environment that refuses to obey the holy laws of nature. The corridors spiral endlessly inward, drawing the isolated servant of the throne into a labyrinth where up is down, and salvation is mathematically impossible. The sheer visual onslaught of this nightmare begins to exact a terrible toll upon mortal flesh. To simply look upon the architecture of the labyrinth is to invite an agony unparalleled in the physical universe. The mind of humanity was forged in the cradle of a terrestrial world, evolving across millennia to comprehend the rigid, comforting laws of three-dimensional space. Up and down, left and right, depth and distance are the pillars upon which human sanity rests. Here those pillars do not merely crumble, they are revealed as cosmic lies. The Inquisitor stares down a corridor that stretches into infinity, yet simultaneously presses so closely against his face that he cannot draw breath. He gazes upon corners that defy all rational geometry, angles that are at once violently acute and sickeningly obtuse. Lines inscribed in the cold stone run perfectly parallel to one another, yet his tearing eyes watch them intersect over and over again in impossible loops. This is a violence not of blade or bolter, but of sheer mathematical paradox. The human brain simply cannot process the data it is receiving. Behind the Inquisitor's eyes, the optic nerves fire in panicked, erratic bursts, misfiring under the weight of impossible geometry until the pressure becomes too great. Thick crimson droplets begin to weep from his tear ducts, staining his cheeks as the fragile blood vessels in his eyes rupture from the strain of witnessing the impossible. A cerebral agony of such apocalyptic intensity blooms within him that it threatens to cleave his skull from the inside out. It is vital to understand the precise nature of this spatial blasphemy, for it is entirely xenos to the shifting horrors of the immaterium. When a mortal mind breaks upon gazing into the warp, it is breaking against a stormy ocean of raw, unbridled emotion and paradoxical chaos. The warp is a place of living nightmares, mutating and writhing without rhyme or reason. But the madness of this labyrinth is profoundly different. This is the apex of Necron chronomancy and spatial engineering, a manifestation of science so utterly advanced that it circles back into dark sorcery. It is a cold, mathematically perfect madness. There is no emotion here, no capricious demon reshaping the walls to mock the faithful. Instead, it is a flawless, suffocating crystal of frozen time and folded dimensions. It is sterile, calculating, and absolutely indifferent to the biological forms struggling within its depths. The angles do not shift because they wish to torment the Inquisitor, but because they exist in dimensions his mortal, terrestrially bound mind is completely blind to. Blinded by his own blood and reeling from the sensory torture, the Inquisitor stumbles backward. He throws his hands out, desperate to find a familiar anchor, a flat wall or a level floor to ground his unraveling mind. He seeks only to retreat, to crawl back the way he came and escape the piercing glare of this immaculate geometric hell. Yet as his armored gauntlet reaches blindly for the stone behind him, his fingers grasp only empty void. The cold air shifts against his skin, carrying the undeniable sensation of motion where there should be none. He turns his aching head, blinking away the blood, only to realize that the space behind him no longer exists. The flawlessly sterile corridors are actively folding inward, swallowing his past steps and leaving him entirely untethered in the dark. Driven by a primal terror that eclipsed even the rigid conditioning of the Holy Ordos, the Inquisitor fled. But flight is a concept bound to the laws of physical reality, a pathetic mortal illusion in a realm that despises natural law. The labyrinth did not merely exist around the prisoner. It shifted with a cold, algorithmic malice. It responded to the frantic footfalls not with the sadistic malice of the warp, but with a profound, crushing indifference. The space between the monolithic pillars began to fold and unfold upon itself. It shifted and snapped like a puzzle of interlocking crystalline facets, engineered by a master cryptech entirely devoid of empathy. Every time the Inquisitor lunged toward a perceived archway or a distant sliver of shadow, the corridor fractured. The impossible geometry shattered into infinite, smaller versions of the exact same path. To step forward was to fall endlessly inward. This was the true, sanity-shredding horror of the Xenos architecture. The prison was simultaneously as vast as a galactic void, and so microscopically small that the heavy air felt like the lid of a lightless coffin pressing down upon the chest. It was a perfect, inescapable fractal. No matter how desperately the Inquisitor sprinted into the echoing dark, the geometry merely repeated. It offered no progress. It offered no exit. It offered not even the merciful release of change. The surrounding scenery was a looping purgatory of non-Euclidean angles that caused the human mind to slowly hemorrhage. Stumbling blindly, desperate for any physical anchor in the shifting madness, the Inquisitor slammed a ceramite-clad gauntlet against the nearest bulkhead. The sensation of the living metal, the dread necrodermis of the ancient dynasties, struck with absolute terror. It was not simply cold. It was a profound void chill that instantly sank through flesh and bone, a parasitic texture that began to aggressively drain the very warmth from the mortal soul. The unyielding surface felt old beyond measure, quietly draining the life of the intruder with utter apathy. The Inquisitor pushed off the dead wall and ran again. He tore through echoing chambers and spiraling fractal stairwells that violently inverted halfway through his ascent. He sprinted until his human lungs should have burned with the acidic fire of total exhaustion. He ran until the muscles in his legs should have torn completely from the bone. Yet the dark corridors remained precisely the same, endlessly spooling out ahead in silent, mocking repetition. And then, a new and entirely different terror began to crystallize within the fractured labyrinth of the Inquisitor's mind. After what felt like standard Terran hours of desperate, panicked sprinting through the unfolding geometry, there was no sweat upon their brow. There was no frantic, drumming rhythm of a terrified heart echoing in their chest. The endless, frantic movement had produced absolutely no physical exertion. To understand the true terror of this endless metal labyrinth is to understand the very nature of the human soul. In the Immaterium, the spirit of a mortal is a flickering candle that casts its reflection into the turbulent, screaming oceans of the warp. Even upon the most wretched and toxic hive worlds, or deep within the lightless void between systems, that fundamental connection remains intact. It is the psychic umbilical cord of our species. It is the sacred channel through which the Master of Mankind provides his divine grace, and the bloody conduit through which the ruinous powers whisper their damning temptations. Yet within this fractal purgatory, that ethereal cord has been cleanly and surgically severed. This is the suffocating absence of the immaterium. It is a spiritual claustrophobia far more crushing than the infinitely repeating geometry of the cold walls. The Inquisitor, a scarred veteran who has stared into the madness of warp breaches and lived, finds no comfort in this sudden quiet. There is no etheric wind brushing against the raw edges of consciousness. There is no ambient malice, no shifting tides of raw emotion, no lurking demons hungering to consume a mortal essence. It is a reality of absolute and unforgiving sterility. Such empty perfection might be mistaken for a sanctuary by the ignorant, but a true and tested servant of the Golden Throne knows better. Where the warp cannot reach, neither can salvation. The guiding light of the Emperor does not shine here. His righteous wrath cannot strike here. This domain exists completely outside the grand game of the cosmos, an abyssal blind spot where both the divine and the profane are equally banished. Seeking refuge from the crushing weight of the impossible architecture, the Inquisitor drops to the floor and reaches desperately for their unshakable faith. Trembling lips form the sacred syllables of the Fade Imperialis. A passionate plea for deliverance is cast outward into the dark. But the prayer does not ascend. The holy words drop dead from their mouth, falling like lead weights onto the unyielding metal deck. There is no echoing resonance in the soul, no warming spark of righteous fury to drive back the shadows. The supplication simply ceases to exist the exact moment it is spoken, swallowed by an absolute and indifferent nothingness. The Inquisitor is entirely and utterly alone, divorced from the very fabric of existence. It is a profound spiritual abandonment that strips away a lifetime of rigid indoctrination and holy zeal in a single, terrifying instant. This complete isolation finalizes the true design of this non-Euclidean hell. It is a sterile tomb, not just for the physical form, but for the fundamental energy of life itself. The sheer horror of the severed soul breeds a sudden and icy clarity within the mind of the captive. In the dead silence of this spiritual vacuum, the Inquisitor listens intently for the rhythmic, grounding comfort of their own racing pulse. The panicked mind demands to feel the frantic thrum of terror pounding in the chest, the sharp intake of recycled air, the urgent biological rhythms of a living creature pushed to the absolute brink of madness. Yet the only sensation is the distant, grinding vibration of the labyrinth rearranging its endless halls. They wait in the quiet dark for a heartbeat that never comes. The lungs remain completely still, drawing no breath from the stagnant atmosphere as a new and terrible revelation begins to take hold. Cast down upon the nonsensical floor of the shifting labyrinth, the Inquisitor surrenders the futile act of prayer. The mind recoils from the impossible angles of the prison, seeking refuge in the familiar sanctuary of the physical form. But there is no sanctuary to be found within the temple of mortal flesh. A terrible stillness has taken root deep within the chest. The Inquisitor realizes with a creeping dread that defies all rational thought that the rhythmic rise and fall of the lungs has ceased. The diaphragm hangs paralyzed, refusing to pull the stagnant air. Yet the expected agony of suffocation never arrives, for the biologically arrested body requires no oxygen to sustain its cursed wakefulness. Trembling, the Inquisitor presses 2 fingers against the throat, seeking the frantic, drumming reassurance of the carotid artery. It beats with an agonizing, glacial slowness, a dying metronome stretched across dilated time. The rich, augmented blood of an Imperial servant flows at an agonizing, glacial crawl, sustained not by the beating of the human heart, but by the profane temporal forces of the labyrinth. In this impossible dimension, the merciless march of biology has been entirely suspended. The frailties of human flesh have been stripped away by an uncaring cosmos. There is no gnawing pang of hunger to signal the passing hours. There is no parched throat demanding water. Cellular decay, the slow and inevitable rot that claims all living things, has been abruptly halted. Even the heavy velvet shroud of sleep is eternally denied to the captive mind. The physical shell is forced into a state of horrific preservation. Autonomic functions cease entirely, yet the limbs remain terrifyingly animate, driven by an agonizingly awake consciousness. This miraculous stasis is not a blessing, but a profound psychological torment. The human body is designed to be a faithful biological clock. It is an organic instrument of demands, needs, and rhythmic cycles. We measure the fleeting seconds by the thumping of our hearts. We measure the passing minutes by the breath rushing through our windpipes. We count the days by the rising tide of exhaustion and the desperate need for rest. Without these fundamental drives, the physical self ceases to be a part of the soul. The Inquisitor is forced to inhabit an Xenos object, a cold suit of meat that refuses to live and refuses to die. The mind becomes a solitary prisoner, trapped within the cold, unfeeling meat of its own suspended biology. The terror mounts as the brain, hyper-vigilant and entirely isolated, tries to comprehend its complete detachment from the organic machine it pilots. Every ancient instinct screams that the body is deceased, yet the consciousness burns on with terrifying clarity. The sheer silence within the chest threatens to deafen the spirit. Deprived of a heartbeat and stripped of breath, the Inquisitor realizes a far greater horror is slowly taking shape in the stagnant dark. If the internal metronome of the flesh has been silenced forever, the passage of eternity can no longer be understood. A desperate obsession begins to bloom within the dark, a frantic hunger to find some external anchor before the mind is swallowed by a timeless void. Deprived of the drumbeat of a mortal heart, the mind is cast adrift. To surrender to that profound biological silence is to invite madness. The Inquisitor understood this with cold clarity. He began to pace a short, repeating length of the fractal corridor. 1 step, 2 steps, turn. With no pulse to measure the passage of existence, he was forced to forge a clock from the sheer iron of his own will. He mouthed the syllables in the breathless void, forcing his paralyzed vocal cords into a phantom pantomime of speech. He recited the sacred roll of martyrs from his own ordo, spacing each syllable to span exactly 1 standard second. When the Imperial histories were exhausted, he turned to the names of the fallen: Savant Kalen, Interrogator Vance, Sister Elysia. Each name was a desperate anchor cast into the void. He intoned the complex verses of the Fede Imperialis, matching the strike of his boots against the crystalline floor to the rhythm of his prayer. 1 step, then another, a whispered litany to the Primarchs, a desperate plea to the master of mankind. Hours bled into what he aggressively categorized as days. To physically anchor these manufactured epochs, he drew his monomolecular blade and carved tally marks directly into the dense ceramite vambrace of his own armor. He turned his left gauntlet into a brutal ledger of survival. 5 harsh scratches equaled an hour. 120 scratches forged a standard Terran day. He sought to build a raft of seconds, a fragile vessel of human mathematics designed to keep his sanity afloat upon an endless ocean of eternity. It was a profoundly noble endeavor, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a mortal resisting the impossible. Yet it was also utterly drenched in tragedy. He was a solitary speck of linear dust, trapped within an impossible, uncaring geometry. The once proud servant of the Golden Throne was reduced to silently mouthing numbers in an empty hallway, a desperate endeavor to prove that they still existed. His armor became scarred with the arithmetic of weeks and months that held no meaning outside his own skull. He recited the names of worlds burned, of Xenos purged, and of saints martyred. He turned the bloody history of the Imperium into a desperate metronome to replace the ticking of his absent biological clock. His mind became a fortress of strict routine, defending its walls against the crushing weight of forever. But a human mind was never meant to function as a chronometer in a realm that openly despises causality. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm began to betray his supreme focus. A holy litany that should have taken exactly 1 minute felt suddenly like an entire lifetime. The space between one footfall and the next seemed to stretch across a chasm of endless twilight. He would carve a fresh tally mark into his armored forearm, only to stare down at the blackened ceramite and realize he could not remember carving the 10 marks that immediately preceded it. The labyrinth was listening to his pathetic human heartbeat of words and numbers. The ancient structure was learning the exact frequency of his sanity. It was preparing to stretch that fragile metronome of faith until it completely unraveled. The fragile rhythm of spoken numbers was the final anchor tethering the Inquisitor to reality. It was a desperate arithmetic meant to enforce sanity upon a realm that despised it. But within the Xenos geometry of the labyrinth, time does not flow like a river. It pools in stagnant lakes, fractures into jagged shards, and shatters against unseen dimensional shores. The Inquisitor reached the number 9,000,004, preparing to form the next digit with dry, breathless lips, when the fundamental laws of chronology simply dissolved. An entire subjective hour of meticulous counting suddenly condensed into a single blinding microsecond. The crushing weight of 60 minutes crashed down upon a solitary heartbeat, obliterating the biological cadence of the human mind. Then, the very next second stretched out across an agony of measureless eternity. Trapped within the amber of that paralyzed moment, the Inquisitor was subjected to an excruciating stasis. The singular second grew so incomprehensibly vast that there was ample time to recall every mortal face the Inquisitor had ever witnessed. The innocent dead of a dozen purged worlds paraded before the mind's eye in agonizingly slow procession. The stoic visages of lost comrades, the weeping faces of the condemned, and the cold masks of the holy ordos, all materialized in absolute, torturous clarity. Decades of buried memory were unpacked and examined within the infinitesimal space before the second could conclude. Sheer, unadulterated panic seized what remained of the Inquisitor's mortal consciousness. This was not the chaotic embrace of the Empyrean, where time is a turbulent storm of psychic malice and demonic whim. This was a cold, mathematically engineered dislocation of reality itself. Past, present, and future began to bleed into one horrifying singularity, rendering the concepts of before and after entirely meaningless. The Inquisitor vividly remembered dying tomorrow, yet simultaneously felt the phantom agonies of brutal wounds that had healed a century ago. The human brain is a fragile organic machine, inextricably bound to the rigid laws of causality. We comprehend the universe only through the steady, sequential progression of cause and effect. When a servant of the Emperor bleeds, he inherently understands that a heretic's blade has just cut him. But in this horrific expanse, the blood fell upward into the air before the offending blade was ever forged. Synapses misfired in a catastrophic biological cascade as the brain frantically attempted to process a reality where consequences precede their origins. The human mind begins to literally tear its own sanity apart when denied the comforting illusion of linear temporal progression. Yet pushing through the suffocating terror of this chronological dissolution, a cold and terrifying clarity began to take shape. The Inquisitor looked past the violent shattering of their own perception to consider the ancient architects of this temporal tomb. To construct a silent prison that so casually breaks the foundational laws of the physical universe requires an intellect utterly divorced from the limitations of flesh. Whoever built this fathomless construct did not merely manipulate the flow of time. To understand the fathomless depths of Necron chronomancy, one must first discard the fragile human illusion of passing days. For a species that slept beneath the dust of dead worlds for 60 million years, a century is less than a single mechanical heartbeat. A millennium is merely a fleeting breath drawn in the suffocating dark. The metallic lords of the infinite empire do not measure existence by the rising and setting of a distant sun. They are the absolute masters of eternity, architects who build impossible monuments out of static, paralyzed moments. To subject a mortal mind to such a staggering timescale is an act of unfathomable cruelty. Yet the deepest horror lies in the chilling truth that there is no malice involved in this execution. The overlord who cast the Inquisitor into this temporal oubliette did not do so to revel in their screaming agony. There is no sadistic glee to be found in the cold, unyielding engrams of the undying. To the sovereign of the tomb world, this holy agent of the Emperor is nothing more than a curious mayfly trapped beneath a heavy glass dome. The Inquisitor is merely a fragile specimen placed casually upon a forgotten shelf to be examined at a later era. The ancient warden is entirely indifferent to the fact that the mortal soul is being stretched relentlessly across an epoch it was never forged to endure. The human mind is a brief and violent spark, designed by biology to burn brightly and extinguish within a meager handful of decades. Forced to burn forever without the promised release of death, the psyche does not simply fracture. It dissolves completely into the boundless, suffocating ocean of an artificial forever. The very concept of waiting becomes utterly obsolete when the universe has been stripped of tomorrow. There is no dawn to hope for, and no dusk to bring rest. In this stagnant, breathless eternity, the Inquisitor drifts helplessly through a silent museum of stolen seconds. Every cherished memory of his past life, every oath sworn to the Golden Throne, turns slowly to ash. His identity is ground down by the unfeeling weight of an indifferent cosmos. He is adrift in a lightless sea of stillborn time, reduced to a silent scream trapped perfectly within the amber of a godlike apathy. He takes a staggering step forward, though whether this physical motion requires a fraction of a second or 1,000 solar years to complete, he can no longer comprehend. Wandering aimlessly through the grey, hanging dust of the timeless void, his shattered senses grope blindly for any familiar anchor in the endless emptiness. Then, without the slightest warning, the oppressive stillness violently shatters. The silent, geometric architecture of his invisible prison begins to fold and shift. The reality around him grinds with the heavy, sickening resonance of ancient stone and living metal. The ageless walls part slowly before his eyes, rearranging their impossible angles to reveal an entirely new horror waiting in the dark. The crushing claustrophobia of the labyrinth shattered without warning. The maddening, jagged angles of the dead-time corridors dissolved as the hyperdimensional trap synchronized with the macro vaults of the tomb world, unfolding into an expanse of staggering, impossible immensity. Before the Inquisitor, a cavernous, spherical gallery unfolded, an expanse so vast that the fragile human mind threatened to fracture, attempting to comprehend its sheer scale. Here, the fundamental laws of physics had been violently rewritten by the cold, calculating will of the Overlord. Gravity no longer anchored the mortal trespasser to a solid floor beneath their boots. Instead, a terrifying, unseen force pulled outward in every conceivable direction, binding the observer to the curving, infinite walls of the globe. Standing upon the inner shell of this hollow, mechanical world, the Inquisitor looked up across the yawning void. They beheld the opposite side of the sphere, a dizzying panorama of endless, glittering architecture suspended above their upturned face. The walls of this colossal chamber were not forged of primitive stone or rusted plasteel. They were constructed entirely of perfectly clear, hard light prisms. These luminous facets interlocked in faultless, inhuman geometric precision, rising and curving away into an abyss of immaculate illumination. This vast space was entirely and unnervingly devoid of shadows. A harsh, clinical radiance emanated from nowhere and everywhere at once, stripping away the comforting, merciful obscurity of the dark. Not a single mote of dust drifted in the stagnant, lifeless air. There was no decay, no entropy, no passage of the relentless ages to stain the perfection of this ancient place. It was a realm held in absolute sterile preservation, mocking the very concept of rot. As the sheer magnitude of the structure crashed down upon the intruder's soul, a chilling realization washed away the final remnants of their defiant courage. They had prepared their spirit to face a dungeon of unfathomable torture, or a grim fortress of apocalyptic war. They had fortified their faith against the festering horrors of a necropolis. But this staggering expanse was none of those things. It was a museum. It was a cosmic gallery, curated by a soulless intelligence that viewed the blazing triumphs and screaming tragedies of the galaxy merely as physical baubles to be catalogued. The Inquisitor, a proud and unyielding servant of the God Emperor, shrank beneath the crushing, suffocating weight of their own utter insignificance. They were reduced to the stature of an insect, a fleeting spark of miserable life trapped within the vault of an eternal, mechanical collector. Every single hard light prism was a flawless display case, stretching by the untold millions across the curved, radiant horizon. Within those unyielding fields of crystalline energy rested the spoils of 1,000,000 forgotten wars and the remnants of dead civilizations. The clinical light revealed a terrifying, unvarnished truth in its shadowless glare. The ancient master of this tomb did not merely conquer the galaxy, he archived it. Drawn by a terrible hypnotic compulsion, the diminutive agent of the Golden Throne took a trembling step toward the nearest shimmering facet of the Great Wall. The human eye struggled to focus on the impossible clarity of the crystalline barrier. Driven by a dread curiosity that overrode their survival instinct, they moved to gaze upon the prize held within. Beyond the perfect barrier, suspended in a frozen, agonizing fraction of a second, a nightmare entity awaited discovery. The Inquisitor steps before a towering facet of perfectly clear crystal. Within its absolute depths, a nightmare of impossible proportions is suspended in eternal stasis. It is an orc, yet to call it such is a profound insult to the terror it truly represents. This is a Krork, an apex biological weapon clad in heavy battleplate of terrifying, brutal sophistication. Its colossal frame dwarfs even the legendary Primarchs, presenting a mountain of dense, emerald-skinned muscle locked in maximum physical tension. The beast is captured perfectly in the very apex of a frenzied, world-shattering charge. A single droplet of thick, viscous saliva hangs forever suspended merely inches from its cavernous, roaring jaw. Its massive gauntlets, capable of crushing armored battle tanks like brittle parchment, are raised high to deliver a devastating blow. But it is the eyes of the creature that draw the mortal soul downward into madness. Violent, burning red orbs remain wide with an apocalyptic rage. It is a pure, unadulterated fury that has been sustained without a single blink for millions upon millions of years. To look upon this absolute apex predator is to peer backward into the darkest, most bloody epochs of galactic history. Long before the rise of mankind, long before the Eldari ruled the stars, the catastrophic conflict known as the War in Heaven shattered the cosmos. The enigmatic and ancient Old Ones engineered the Krork as the ultimate biological weapon. They were forged to combat the soulless Necrons and the star-devouring gods. These creatures were an unfathomable pinnacle of brutish intellect, psychic resonance, and devastating physical power. When the Old Ones were slaughtered and the galaxy burned to ash, the Krork lost their cosmic purpose. Deprived of their grand war and left to a ruined universe, their mighty lineage degraded over countless agonizing millennia. Their galaxy-spanning intellect dwindled, their colossal stature shrank, and the godlike warriors devolved entirely. They became the fragmented, squabbling greenskin hordes that relentlessly plague the Imperium of man today. Yet here, preserved in immaculate crystalline silence, the pure, uncorrupted apex of their breed stands entirely untouched by time. The sheer, staggering antiquity of this single specimen forces a horrifying realization upon the fragile human mind. This silent, vast gallery did not begin its harvest during the glory of the Great Crusade, nor during the treacherous nightmares of the Age of Strife. This labyrinth has been accumulating its prisoners since the galaxy was truly young. It has been snatching gods, kings, and monsters from the very dawn of creation itself. As the Inquisitor finally pulls their aching gaze away from the frozen behemoth, the faint luminescence of the endless corridor reveals a profoundly terrifying truth. The pathway stretches onward into the infinite dark, and the mighty Krork is but a single pane of glass among untold millions. The agonizing revelation of the ancient greenskin was merely the threshold to a much vaster, unfathomable nightmare. Stepping deeper into the abyssal gallery, the Inquisitor walked a morbid pilgrimage through the archives of the absolute extinct. Here lay the forgotten sins of a violently hostile galaxy, perfectly preserved in a state of perpetual, screaming stasis. He passed crystalline cages housing entities composed entirely of swirling phosphorescent gas. They were caught forever in mid-swirl, their nebulous tendrils reaching outward in a desperate frozen plea for a salvation that would never come. Just beyond them stood rows of multi-limbed xenos clad in iridescent chitinous armor. Their jagged anatomical structures defied every sacred text, every biological law, and every forbidden Ordo Xenos database the Inquisitor had ever studied. These beings were not mere mutations or feral offshoots from the fringes of known space. They were the apex predators of forgotten epochs, conquerors of worlds that had long since crumbled into interstellar dust. Further down the grand, echoing corridor loomed a towering psychic monstrosity. The beast was wreathed in jagged halos of frozen warp lightning, its furious sorcery trapped in a single unblinking moment of terrifying cosmic power. A profound melancholia washed over the Inquisitor as the true nature of this vault became undeniably clear. He was looking at the literal ghosts of eradicated eras. Entire species completely wiped from the collective memory of the cosmos now existed nowhere else in the material universe. Their rich histories, their wars, and their triumphs had been reduced to pathetic novelties. They were nothing more than exquisite trinkets, locked away within the private display case of an undying metallic overlord. The sheer scale of this hoarding induced a crushing sense of insignificance. The Inquisitor felt dwarfed, reduced to a fleeting speck of mortal dust, wandering through a sprawling mausoleum of dead gods and lost monsters. He was surrounded by millions upon millions of living, conscious beings. Yet the extreme isolation of this place was absolute and maddening. None of these captive nightmares could twitch a single muscle. None could draw a breath to speak a word or cry out in their eternal, unseen torment. They could not acknowledge his fragile human presence, nor could they acknowledge the presence of the entities standing mere inches beside them. Each and every prisoner was irrevocably alone within the inescapable prison of their own paralyzed mind. They were left to scream in a sterile silence that would endure until the very stars burned themselves into cold cinders. The suffocating quiet of the Grand Gallery pressed against the Inquisitor, thick and heavy with the crushing weight of uncounted billions of stolen lifetimes. He dragged his heavy boots onward, driven by a morbid, inescapable compulsion to witness the true depth of this mechanical purgatory. As he ventured deeper, the ambient temperature of the vault plummeted, and the static air grew impossibly foul. A distinct shift occurred in the oppressive atmosphere, overriding the quiet despair of the extinct exhibits. The creeping dread of the forgotten Xenos began to pale, eclipsed by an entirely new and agonizing sensation. Just ahead, a different kind of shadow seemed to devour the pale light of the crystalline floor. A sickening pressure built behind the Inquisitor's eyes, radiating outward from a solitary looming exhibit. It stood apart from the wretched masses, pulsing with an aura of pure, suffocating malevolence that threatened to crush his very soul. Beyond the quiet tombs of 1,000 extinct species, the Grand Gallery gives way to an architecture of absolute suppression. The air itself grows impossibly heavy, weeping with a dead cold that bites through both armor and bone. The Inquisitor forces each step forward, drawn inevitably toward a section of the corridor where the very walls are choked with immense bands of hyperdense alloy. This is pure tesseract metal, woven with agonizingly intricate chains of living necrodermis that pulse with blinding hyperdimensional containment energies. It is a vault hidden within a vault, a structural anomaly designed not to keep interlopers out, but to endlessly torture the atrocity held within. Before the Inquisitor can even press a gauntlet to the viewing pane, their knees violently strike the floor. The sheer, passive physical weight of the entity behind the glass drives the breath from their mortal lungs. Looking into the containment field, they see no biological creature, but a localized tear in the fundamental fabric of reality. It is a being composed of pure star matter and boundless, unadulterated spite. Though it is frozen in a state of chronological suspension, the entity remains intensely, horrifically aware of its surroundings. A silent, crushing aura of gravitational anomaly radiates constantly from the captive, flooding the corridor with a material hatred so ancient and dense that it leaves the phantom taste of incinerated ash upon the Inquisitor's tongue. This is a shard of a Catan, a severed fragment of the cosmic divinities that once devoured the stars themselves. To kneel before such a captive is to suddenly understand the true, terrifying scale of the Necron Empire. The hyperdimensional traps known as Tesseract Labyrinths were never conceived with the fragile races of humanity in mind. They are ultimate monuments of cosmic hubris, forged eons ago during the cataclysmic war in heaven. The hyperdimensional technologies powering these geometric prisons were originally engineered to fracture, contain, and enslave the fundamental gods of the material universe. To the undying metallic masters of this tomb, utilizing a tesseract to hold a human being is not an act of specialized cruelty, but a profound afterthought. It is an insulting display of overwhelming superiority, akin to employing an engine of planetary destruction to crush a solitary crawling insect in the dirt. Trembling before this imprisoned singularity, the Inquisitor stares into the writhing, chained essence of the star god. The entity radiates a continuous, eternal scream of fury that cannot even ripple the necrodermis tethers binding it to the dark. Every ounce of Imperial faith, every lifetime of rigorous mental conditioning fractures completely beneath the crushing weight of this revelation. The terrible truth of this labyrinth becomes absolute and utterly undeniable. If a transcendent deity of the physical cosmos, a literal god of the material realm, cannot break the walls of its geometric cell, then a mortal creature of mere flesh and blood has absolutely no hope of escape. The grand gallery of the dead offers no exit, only the cold promise that eternity here is absolute. The revelation of the shackled star god brings with it the ultimate and crushing truth. There is no victory to be found in this geometric hell. The bolt pistol, a trusted relic of 100 bloody purges, slips from trembling fingers and clatters soundlessly against the fractal floor. It is a useless piece of iron in a realm devoid of flesh to tear or blood to spill. The Holy Rosette, the very symbol of the Emperor's divine mandate, holds no authority in this pocket of folded reality. Defiance is a resource that has finally run dry. The Inquisitor begins to understand the true architecture of their doom. They are not merely imprisoned, they have been entirely excised from the narrative of the cosmos. The Holy Ordos do not know where they are. The astropathic choirs sing to deaf stars, their psychic screams unable to pierce the non-Euclidean walls of the Tesseract. There will be no rescue team bursting through the emerald darkness. Even in the most desperate and triumphant of fantasies, there is no salvation to be had. Even if a glorious strike force of the Adeptus Astartes were to descend upon the tomb world and shatter the metallic overlord into burning slag, it would bring no salvation. Were the labyrinth itself to rest safely in the armored vaults of the Imperium, it simply would not matter. The greatest tech magi of Mars could scrutinize the cube for a millennium and never decipher the hyperdimensional locks binding its prisoners. To the universe of matter and time, the Inquisitor is already a ghost. They are a closed file in the deepest archives of the Inquisition, a redacted name slowly fading into the dust of forgotten martyrs. The staggering weight of this absolute erasure breaks the human spirit entirely. Slowly, heavily, the veteran servant of the Golden Throne slides down the smooth surface of the cell. The broken agent slumps against the invisible hard light boundary, staring blankly into the abyss. The fight is over. There is no heretic left to interrogate or execute. There is no esoteric puzzle to solve and no arcane doorway to unlock. There is only the slow, quiet, agonizing surrender to inevitability. The silence of the labyrinth presses inward, heavier than the crushing depths of an ocean trench. It is a profound and sterile emptiness that offers no physical enemy to strike or strangle. Without a physical target for their righteous hatred, the human mind is left utterly alone to consume itself. The unblinking emerald glow offers neither shadow nor rest. Time here does not flow in linear rivers, but pools in stagnant, inescapable lakes of pure consciousness. The true horror of infinite isolation begins to take root in the crumbling foundations of their sanity. Every memory of the world outside becomes a jagged instrument of torment. Thought processes begin to stutter and repeat in the suffocating stillness. The mind begins to loop and fray, buckling under the unbearable weight of an endless, waking eternity. With the cessation of physical struggle comes the true horror of the mind. The human brain is a finite vessel, a fragile construct of meat and electrical impulse never designed to contain the infinite. Without the distraction of exhausted muscles or the futile hope of escape, the Inquisitor is left alone with the crushing weight of eternity. The ego cannot endure such pressure. It begins to fray, tearing at the seams of sanity as the vastness of the artificial eternity presses inward. To survive the unbearable sensory flood, the mind begins to jettison its own contents, desperately making room for an encroaching abyss that has no bottom. The erosion of identity is not swift, nor is it merciful. It is a slow, agonizing psychological vivisection. First to vanish are the sensory anchors of a mortal life once lived. The soft, rhythmic patter of acidic rain against the spires of holy terror slips away, replaced by the soulless vacuum of the artificial dimension. Then, the faces of their lineage fade into featureless voids. The memories of fellow acolytes and mentors dissolve into terrifying smears of pale flesh within the theatre of the mind. With personal history scoured clean, the foundational pillars of belief begin to crumble. The sacred tenets of the Imperial Creed, verses memorized in the halls of the scholar progenium and recited in the darkest trenches, become meaningless syllables. Concepts of duty, faith, and the master of mankind lose their shape, tumbling into the dark like ash on the wind. Finally, the ultimate anchor is severed. The Inquisitor forgets their own name. The title, the authority, the self, all are swallowed by the ravenous dark. What remains is a horrifying loop of naked consciousness. The mind cannot sleep. It cannot dream. Worst of all, it cannot retreat into the numbing sanctuary of true madness. Insanity would be a mercy, a fractured lens to distort the pain. Instead, they are trapped in a state of absolute agonizing hyperlucidity. They are forced to act as the paralyzed witness to their own unmaking. It is the terror of watching the soul peel away layer by layer, feeling the exact moment the ego dies, yet remaining completely aware of the emptiness left behind. They become a hollow observer, an isolated point of raw awareness, suspended in an ocean of impossible sensory violation. There is no past to comfort them, no future to hope for, only the endless stretching present of psychological torture. The entity that was once a feared agent of the Golden Throne is reduced to a formless consciousness, trapped inside a silent skull. Time loses all meaning in this suspended state of mental execution. The motionless husk floats in the dark, entirely emptied of the human spirit that once drove it to conquer worlds. Yet just as the final spark of identity threatens to extinguish completely, a new sensation violates the void. Through the hollowed-out receptors of a dying nervous system, the raw awareness registers a profound shift. The terrible stillness of the cage is breaking. Something in the immediate environment is beginning to subtly change around their paralyzed shell. Time loses its final fragile hold upon the mind, replaced by the glacial permanence of the infinite. The Inquisitor has remained utterly motionless for what feels like uncounted eons, a singular point of stagnant flesh within an ever-shifting tesseract. Because they do not move, the labyrinth ceases to recognize them as an intruder. The cold, calculating intellect of the tomb complex reassesses this silent, statuesque form and reclassifies it not as vermin, but as an artifact. It is the ultimate and most terrible manifestation of the nightmare. The physical culmination of their profound despair begins at the periphery of their vision. A creeping onset of hard light geometry blooms from the obsidian floor. It is a sickly, luminescent matrix woven from the captive energies of dying stars, and it slowly washes over the worn leather of their boots. There is no heat in this verdant glow, only the absolute zero of temporal stasis. The crystalline structure advances with predatory patience. It climbs the greaves of his battered power armor, sealing the joints in seamless sheaths of Xeno's glass. It scales the purity seals, freezing the parchment into brittle, immortal flakes of frost. As the emerald light crawls over their gauntlets, locking their trembling fingers into rigid permanence, a fleeting, ghostly spark of human instinct screams at them to move. Every muscle in their ruined body aches to thrash, to shatter the forming crystal, to draw a weapon and die fighting in the name of the Golden Throne. Yet the absolute apathy of their broken mind countermands the flesh. The will to survive has been hollowed out, replaced by a dreadful, suffocating peace. They merely watch, detached and serene, as they are physically welded into the wall of the gallery. The horror of this metamorphosis is amplified by its absolute tranquility. There is no agony of torn meat, no violent dismemberment. Instead, there is only the creeping calcification of a living soul being rendered into a static display. The hard light matrix encases their torso, sealing their paralyzed flesh within a cage of impossible geometry. They are becoming an object, a literal exhibit in a museum of despair designed by soulless gods. The green glow illuminates the hollow contours of their face, painting their features in the morbid hues of necrodermis. They are aware of every millimeter of their flesh turning to stone, feeling the creeping necrosis of their own humanity. They do not struggle as the luminous resin climbs their neck. They embrace the stasis, surrendering their flesh to the great silent gallery of the Xenos architect. The final layers of the matrix begin to close over their widening, unblinking eyes, preparing to lock them forever in their eternal posture. The transmutation is complete. The hard light matrix ceases its blinding hum, settling into a dull, eternal luminescence. Where a loyal servant of the God Emperor once stood, there is now only a flawless statue of atomic perfection. The Inquisitor is perfectly posed, locked in a rigid tableau of perpetual agony and awe. To their left stands the towering, brutish form of the Krork, its violent momentum captured in immutable stasis. To their right, an Xenos monstrosity from a forgotten epoch reaches out with limbs that will never complete their grasp. They are neighbors in a gallery of the damned, curated by a mind devoid of a soul. Every muscle, every sinew, every nerve ending of the Inquisitor is locked in absolute physical paralysis. The lungs cannot draw breath, the heart cannot beat. The eyes, wide and staring into the abyssal geometry of the tomb world, cannot even blink. Yet the true horror of the infinite collection is not the preservation of the flesh, but the preservation of the mind. Behind those frozen, unblinking eyes, the Inquisitor's consciousness remains entirely intact. The mind is fully awake, trapped within the unbreakable prison of its own perfectly preserved body. They are screaming. It is an infinite, silent scream that reverberates only within the confines of a captive skull. It is a shriek of boundless madness that will echo in the dark until the stars burn out, and the heat death of the universe claims all things. There is a profound, terrifying philosophy written into the very architecture of the Necron Empire. We mortals of the Imperium are defined by our fragility. Our lives are brief, violent and messy sparks burning against the overwhelming dark. We bleed, we age, we rot, and we die. Yet in that very impermanence lies the sacred beauty of the human spirit. We sacrifice our fleeting moments for a cause greater than ourselves, returning our souls to the golden throne when our duty is done. The Necrons despised this messy impermanence. They traded their souls for a cold, horrific perfection. They conquered death, but in doing so, they eradicated life. Their immortality is a sterile, static nightmare, a universe reduced to a meticulously organized museum of dead things. They view the chaotic vibrancy of the galaxy not as something to be experienced, but as raw material to be catalogued, subjugated and displayed. When mortals gaze up at the night sky, they must look past the gleaming light of the Astronomicon and peer into the suffocating darkness between the stars. Somewhere out there, within the hidden depths of the crown world Solemnus, the grand gallery remains open. Dust never gathers on the exhibits. Time holds no dominion over the grand displays of the silent curator. And somewhere within those endless echoing halls, that loyal inquisitor stands exactly as he did on the day he was taken. He is awake right now. He will be awake tomorrow. He is locked in the dark corners of the 41st millennium, enduring an eternity of perfect, unyielding horror. He will never die, and he will never stop screaming.